The United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, among other things, produces the Human Development Index, very much a real measure of the well-being or otherwise of our species in this time. I'm here in New York on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly to speak with Achim Steiner, administrator of the UNDP. Mr. Steiner, let's start with the existential question of climate change. We heard new pledges at UNGA from US President Joe Biden and from China's President Xi Jinping. But did they go far enough?
It's one of the strange things in the history of humankind, but also in the journey towards a global climate response. Had these announcements been made 10 years ago, they would have been revolutionary, both in terms of the changing course and also in terms of the magnitude and implication. I mean, here is the United States doubling multi-billion-dollar financing towards an international climate response. Here is China, a country that often has been pointed at as being the major exporter of coal-fired electricity generating infrastructure that is being built around the world, announcing that from here on onwards it will no longer export coal-fired power stations. These are very significant announcements. And yet, here we are in the year 2021, we have lost so much time. The window for us to actually stay within a 1.5 degree world is probably already closing, if not closed. So I think the impatience and the concern that the Secretary General, but I think literally hundreds of millions of citizens around the world are now expressing towards the challenge of climate change, in part explain why these announcements are not yet enough. They are very significant in themselves, and we have actually seen remarkable things happen. The advent of renewable energy. 15 years ago, it was something that was basically science fiction. It was in the drawers of engineers. Today, we have a renewable energy economy where every year more money is being invested in new electricity generating infrastructure that's renewable than in oil, gas, coal, and nuclear combined. So we are already in the midst of an energy revolution. And yet, I think what people quite clearly sense, and that is a fact, we are still losing the race in terms of a race against time. And that is where we need to accelerate ambition. And I think Glasgow this year is one of those moments that not only in terms of the annual meetings of the climate conference is significant, it's also the fifth year in terms of a cycle where the Paris Agreement, quite ingeniously designed into this agreement that was difficult to reach in 2015, a ratcheting up mechanism. So every 5 years, countries would meet and raise their level of ambition. So over time, we will close the gap between where science is telling us we should be already in reducing emissions and where the world has been able to agree to move. Now, the good news is that curve is exponential in the sense of decarbonization. The bad news is we have got far less time left than we had 10 years ago, and that is our problem.
Switching to the pandemic, which was also top of the agenda at the UNGA, what are your views on vaccine equity?
The last 18 months, I think, will go down in history books as moments of extraordinary ingenuity and breakthroughs. For example, the ability to develop multiple vaccines in record time and therefore having the means by which to ultimately contain this pandemic. And yet also extraordinary failures in leadership, in responses, in particularly at this moment in time, vaccine equity. Going back to Amartya Sen, who once framed this notion that famines don't just occur because there's not enough food. They are failures in the way our systems are able to reach people. We are in an equivalent of a vaccine famine right now. And I think that understanding of how our institutions, our leaders, and our response mechanisms have failed us is, I think, a moment of deep introspection. And again, the Secretary General of the United Nations in his opening speech this week was very clear about this. This is something that will leave a deep scar on the psyche of our collective confidence in one another. And yet, as always, this is not only a moment of being hopeless or feeling helpless. We are seeing now a recognition that vaccine inequity is self-defeating to those who are vaccinated, because if the rest of the world doesn't get access to vaccines, the pandemic will simply keep on coming back. But secondly, we're also seeing commitments being made right now that, ultimately will address, I hope by maybe the middle of next year of 2022, that objective of maybe having 70% of the world vaccinated. Now, it's still an extraordinary acceleration of effort, of financing, and of production, but it is doable. The question is, will our political leaders, will the world of financing, and will the international platforms that we have for cooperation truly allow us to achieve that.
Achim Steiner, thank you very much for your time today.